Hello and welcome to our webinar this afternoon. Thank you for joining us today on Wednesday the 17th of June for our webinar Post-Lockdown Risk Assessments and Moving On, which is the second part in our series of an Almshouse Toolkit. My name is Tim Rutherford and I am the head of Stone King's Charity and Social Enterprise Sector Group, and I'm joined today by Elizabeth Fathi, who is the Director of Almshouses at the Trust Partnership. As this is a webinar and you are attendees, your computer cameras and microphones are off, but you will be able to communicate with us to ask questions at any point during the webinar via the Q&A function. And this option is available on the right-hand side of your screen, and it looks like a square box inside a circle. And you can type in your question and it will be sent through directly to us, and all questions will remain anonymous. Now, we'll try to address as many questions as possible, either during or at the end of the webinar, but if we run out of time, we will be following up any unanswered questions at the end. And finally, in a few days' time, you will receive a copy of today's presentation and a link to the webinar recording so that you can watch it again or sell it as a DVD for Christmas presents. So if we can move on, please, to the next slide. So in terms of what we're going to cover today, obviously this is an Almshouse toolkit, so we are focusing on Almshouse charities, but I know there are a number of people attending who perhaps aren't necessarily related to Almshouses, and a lot of what we're going to talk about will actually be of wider relevance to all charities. But in terms of the topics, we'll be going through assessing and minimising operational risks while lifting lockdown, thinking about financial risks now and in the next few months, how you minimise compliance risks, and then looking at a few governance issues and limiting trustee liability. And then we'll have time for questions. So I'll now hand over to Liz.
Thank you, Tim. So just to look at the risk management as a process, and I'll do this in summary because we could spend
you're currently on mute.
Oh, I have unmuted. Am I still on mute? Am I still on mute because I have unmuted?
Liz, I can hear you.
Okay, I wonder if Tim can't hear me. Shall I carry on? Sorry about this. Shall I keep going?
Yes, please.
Okay, so I'll talk about the risk management process and it'll be in summary because it could take some time if it wasn't in summary. So risk management, it's an essential process for a charity to undertake, and it's especially important at times like this. I think trustees are all concerned about the level of uncertainty and how they can mitigate this, and that's what we're going to address today. So first thing that really trustees should look at is their risk policy. They need to address an appetite for risk. It might be that your appetite for risk is now a little more cautious, a little more nervous than it was. So it's important to be clear and open with looking at what your appetite is. We're looking at re-examining the risks that you face, minimising the adverse effects and maximising the opportunities. And we're looking at reassigning roles and responsibilities. And this is quite an important part of a risk process, because a risk management process, because when assumptions are made about who is actually holding a responsibility, if there are assumptions that are wrong, that's when things go terribly wrong. And it's reputedly the biggest cause of operational failure, is if you think somebody else has got it and they haven't. So what we're looking at is creating a risk register, and by looking at that, we're going to use the Charity Commission Guidance Note 26 headings. They're listed there. They're the operational, financial, compliance and governance headings, and they're added to in CC 26 by external factors, but we're just going to concentrate on those for today. So in looking at a risk register, the process will be the same for all. What you're looking at, what your next door charity is looking at, what the next door almshouse is looking at will be different, but the process is essentially the same. A classic current risk would be thinking about loss of income from an investment that you may have. We're being told by wealth managers that investments could potentially be going down 30% in the income that they're affording a charity, and that is an obvious risk. So if we just take that one step further and perhaps go on to the next slide, which is just going to talk about how you assess the likelihood of the risk happening and the impact. What the process is that you look at your risk under your heading. So let's take that financial one. So you would say the financial risk of less income, and you would score that by looking at the likelihood of that happening and then the impact, what the impact would be. You're looking at a score of 1 to 5. So the likelihood that your investment income is going to reduce is high. In fact, you could say it's highly probable. And so you may want to give it a 5 as an example. You then look at the impact of that. And if you were about to put a new roof on your almshouse, the impact of that loss of income is going to be potentially extreme. You would give it another 5. If you did 5 times 5, that's a 25 score, the highest level of risk and impact. If it was a moderate impact because you could cope with it, or even an insignificant impact being 1, you can see how then your weighting would come down. And what you're trying to do is to get that priority of weighting so that you can look at the highest risks and look at how you would mitigate them. And that's the next thing you look at. You look at what would you do? You wouldn't perhaps put that new roof on the almshouse, in which case it would be a moderate impact. So instead of having a 25, you could go down to say 5 times 2. The likelihood of it happening is the same, it's 5. You're not going to change that, but you can look at the impact of it. So you can have 5 times 2 is 10. So by mitigating, you're rescoring and you're finding that that is now a lower priority. And that is the basis of a risk register. And that's why it's a good process to do. Just before we leave this slide, the program of management is important, because once you've done your risk register, you will need to burrow down into some of those mitigating actions and how you're going to deal with them. And you'll then look at your risk assessment. Risk register and risk assessment are different. Risk assessments tend to be much more on the focusing on the individual problem that you've got and how you're going to mitigate that in an assessment view. So going on to the next slide, we look at some of our operational risks. So just remembering those CC26 headings: operation, compliance, governance, financial, etc. Let's just quickly look at operational. And if we just look at new operational risks, so the COVID-19 operational risks that you might want to look at now, they would be things like the risk would be that you have the death or illness of a resident during this pandemic, regardless of the cause of illness or death. And the reason that there's a risk there is that there are risks attached to what you would normally do in those circumstances and what you would have to do now. The same with coronavirus on site. If you have a resident, for example, or a member of staff who tests positive for coronavirus, the risks that you're facing are different. Residents, number 3, residents, staff, trustees not heeding government advice or not being aware of your new policies and procedures. That's a classic where you actually do address a policy, address a risk. You write a new policy, you look at a new procedure, and then nobody does anything about it. These are all risks that you will have to mitigate by making sure that you're constantly monitoring training, etc. Not keeping up with fast-moving government advice, that's a classic for reassigning a role. You might want to say to a trustee, actually, can you hold that? It's a weekly update that we need. Can you hold that? Can you take that? Can you take ownership of it? And managing a void turnaround is an interesting one. I'm just going to pause there before I hand over to Tim on the next slide, because managing a void turnaround is an illustration of where you have got a risk coming from two facets, if you like. The first is that you have an obligation as trustees to turn that void around quickly, because the obligation is that you don't want to lose income. At the same time, you've got your alternative obligations and risks are that you're in a pandemic and there are certain things you need to cover off before you can do that. So classic for that would be looking at a risk assessment. So now you've identified something on a risk register, the loss of income from a void, the fact that you're obliged to do something about it, the operational risks that come from that, what would you look at? So for example, you would do a risk assessment and you would look at checking that your contractor coming on site, perhaps to do a refurbishment, has a specific process, and you would understand that process so you could dovetail into it. You would ensure that your other residents on site, your residents on site, are aware of what's going on and that they feel safe and reassured. You would be talking to them and communicating to them. And just as an aside, there is an NHS volunteer responders telephone number that you can find online, which allows residents who are unhappy or unsure about things to actually contact somebody who's a volunteer. So there's plenty of people out there to help. You might want to deep clean the property before a resident moves in. Suggest that the new resident isolates for 14 days. You might want to advertise the vacancy because there may be more people out there, more potential beneficiaries these days than there were 2 months ago. Times have changed. You might want to carry out your interviews for new residents over a video link. And of course, you need to look at social distancing when you're showing anybody around or appointing, handing over keys, etc. So that's just an illustration, that managing a void turnaround, of where you're looking at an umbrella risk in a register, and then you're burrowing down in a risk assessment to make sure that you're covering everything. If in doubt, of course, take the advice of professionals. And then there's that that chestnut that everybody asks us, and we got lots of questions on before, which is all about how far do trustees have to go to discharge their duty of care. So I'll hand over to Tim.
Thank you. And if we could move on to the next slide. So as Liz said, obviously the duty of care is really key to understanding risk management and what your responsibilities are. And the duty of care imposed on a trustee comes from two sources, common law and statute. And as far as the common law duty of care is concerned, a trustee satisfies the test if they take all those precautions that an ordinary prudent person of business would take in managing similar affairs of their own, where they understand they have a moral obligation to provide for others. And this is an objective test. So the fact that you might be doing your best makes no difference at all if you don't meet the objective standard. In addition, there's a statutory duty of care under the Trustee Act, which is a slightly higher threshold. Now, this doesn't strictly apply to trustees of a corporate charity, but there are similar duties under the Companies Act or the Charities Act, depending upon how you're constituted. And the statutory duty of care is to exercise such skill and care as is reasonable in the circumstances, having regard in particular to any special knowledge or experience that your trustee holds themselves out as having. So for example, if you have a trustee who is an expert in the law relating to almshouses, they will be judged to a much higher standard. But if they were a solicitor who were an expert in, say, shipping law, then they wouldn't be judged to any higher standard than their co-trustees. Now, the difficulty is there's no definitive meaning of what is reasonable, and it's something that has to be viewed in all the circumstances. But it is essentially an objective test, again, save to the extent that if you hold yourself out as having a particular skill, then it may be considered on a subjective basis at some points. Now, if as a trustee you breach your duty of care, then you may be required to compensate the charity, beneficiaries, staff, or volunteers even for any loss that is suffered. So if we can move on to the next slide, we can put this in the context of the trustee of an almshouse. And essentially, the duty of care can really be summarised as ensuring that accommodation is only provided to individuals who meet the necessary qualifications to be beneficiaries of your charity, providing beneficiaries with accommodation that is of appropriate standard and suitable to their needs. And this is often one of the key areas, and it's about ensuring that the accommodation doesn't expose the beneficiaries to any undue risk or harm, and that you meet all of the relevant statutory requirements in relation to accommodation. You also need to think about carrying out appropriate due diligence to ensure that residents are able to live appropriately within the parameters of the accommodation that's on offer. And you also have to ensure the safety of your residents. And when individual residents are no longer able to manage living independently, or are causing a problem for other residents' safe enjoyment of the accommodation, you need to take steps to end the provision of the accommodation so that they don't become a risk to themselves or to other residents. And you also have a proactive duty to safeguard and promote the welfare of beneficiaries, in particular if they are vulnerable adults. Now, at the point your beneficiaries do start to become vulnerable adults, you'll have additional duties under the relevant safeguarding legislation. But it's important to remember that your duty of care doesn't extend into enabling or facilitating residents to continue living in the accommodation if they're no longer able to live independently. It doesn't require you to dispense medication or provide medical or personal care. It doesn't require you to take responsibility for your residents' health and treatment, or to provide them with meals, nursing, or personal services. And quite often there can be a blurring of the line, and it can be very easy for trustees and staff or volunteers to start taking on responsibilities that go much further than is necessary to meet your duty of care to residents. And when you start to do that and take on additional responsibilities, you need to be aware that even though you may be doing it voluntarily, you are still going to be judged by a high standard duty of care. And you may also find that there are other duties that you have to comply with under the care legislation. So in terms of thinking about the risks within the charity, you need to be sure you're clear as to what activities you are prepared to do and what things you are not prepared to do to make sure that you minimise your risk. And then communicate this clearly with residents, families, and other stakeholders such as social services. So I'm now going to hand back to Liz so we can start looking at financial risks.
Thanks, Tim. And just to say that we're happy to take any questions. I know duty of care is quite a big subject for everybody, and we get a lot of questions on it. So if you do want to ask us anything on duty of care, we hope to have a bit more time at the end of this webinar to answer those. So moving on to assessing financial risks, because we're sticking with those CC26 headings of operational, financial, governance, etc. So looking now just quickly at financial risks. Financial risks are obviously hugely important for you to address and to review in the current time. A written investment policy is something that the Charity Commission expects all trustees to have. Even if you don't have reserves or investments, you would be expected to look at how you're moving towards achieving some savings and reserves. So you are expected to consider this matter. And I've just put there a quote from CC14, which is the guidance from the Charity Commission on investment matters, and it's a guide for trustees, well worth looking at. They do say there, if trustees have considered the relevant issues, taken advice where appropriate, and reached a reasonable decision, they are unlikely to be criticised for their decisions or adopting a particular investment policy. And I think that this is an ideal time to review because that relevant issue would be something like COVID-19. So it is important to now look at your investment policies. We are, after all, ticking them. When you do your annual return, everybody's ticking that they've got a written investment policy, so it's important to keep it updated. So we just highlighted there some new financial risks. And we've touched before on the one reduced income from investments, and just to pause there for a second, because when you're looking at your investment policy, when you're looking at your risk register, if you have that reduced income, and the one we used just a minute ago was the amount of money that you will get from any investments that you've got at the moment, if that's going to reduce by 30%, and it does have a knock-on impact on what you've got budgeted for in your programme of works, perhaps for the next year or two. It's important that if you're no longer going to carry out that programmed works, because that's how you're going to mitigate that risk, then you don't forget that program works. Otherwise, you're storing up trouble for 10 years' time or 5 years' time when you pick it up again. So it's important not to forget it, and it's important to relook at what you're doing in a budget forecast of 5 years and perhaps even 10 years. The scale of budget forecasting is changing. It needs to be a micro scale and a macro scale at the moment. You need to be looking at it fairly consistently and constantly, and you need to be looking at it for 5 and 10 years and making sure that things are still put back in those budgets. Reduced income from WMC arrears, number 2 there, that's an interesting one, because we do have questions about people saying, so can we give our residents a holiday from payments? And strictly speaking, that shouldn't be necessary, because although you might find you've got a temporary reduced income, it should be caught up with housing benefit. After all, a weekly maintenance contribution should never be above the housing benefit level for that area. So in fact, although you might have a temporary reduction in income, it shouldn't be a permanent reduction. You should be able to have some backdated housing benefit to cover that. So it's not really a matter of giving a holiday, more of getting a sensitive repayment plan established and communicating with residents. Reduced income from voids we've touched on before, and increased expenditure on implementing safety measures. All these things, they need thinking about. It's not just the tangible that you can measure and put a cost to, it's also the time taken and trustee involvement if you've got no staff. So all these things need looking at. Now I'm going to hand over to Tim, because he's going to talk about reserves and endowment, and when you might feel that you need to look at your reserves and endowment and maybe use them if you can.
Thank you. So if we could move on to the next slide. So reserves, well, we all understand the importance of saving for a rainy day. And in fact, if you look at the current climate, perhaps it's a case of saving for a sunny day. But for trustees, the position isn't entirely straightforward. Trustees have a legal duty to ensure that the charity's income is applied for the charity's purposes within a reasonable time of receipt. And there is some debate as to whether this applies to corporate charities, but the Commission's view is that it does. But notwithstanding this duty to spend your income within a reasonable period, it is accepted that trustees may from time to time build up reserves to ensure their charity's future sustainability. And most almshouse charities will have express provisions to accumulate reserves for specific purposes, so to build up a cyclical maintenance fund or an extraordinary maintenance fund. And it's clear why you would build up these funds and what you would use them for. But beyond that, you may also want to consider whether you need to build up reserves for other purposes. For example, to provide funds for staff costs during a future lockdown, or maybe to smooth falls in your investment income. Now, as part of your ongoing risk assessment, you should consider whether anything has happened as a result of the current pandemic that's identified an area for which it would have been useful to have built up some reserves. And if as trustees you're satisfied that it's in the best interest of the charity, there is an implied power to create reserves for these purposes. But when thinking about reserves, you need to remember that these are supposed to be monies that are freely available to spend. So reserves would exclude permanent or expendable endowment, designated funds, or restricted funds. And you also need to take into account that if you were to over-reserve, you may face tax consequences if HMRC took the view that your income and capital gains aren't being applied properly for charitable purposes. So you need to have a clear reserves policy that explains why you need reserves, what level of reserves you need and for what purposes, what steps you're going to take to establish and maintain that level of reserves, and how you'll monitor and report on the policy. And this should obviously be based upon the current understanding of your finances, your forecasts of income and expenditure, and your analysis of likely changes. And it's something that should be updated as circumstances change. You may find that your need for reserves in a particular area changes as time changes. But you also need to plan realistically. There's no point saying, actually, we're going to build up an enormous pot of reserves if that is going to prejudice your ability to operate in the short term. So if we can move to the next slide, please. Now, in addition to having a really clear policy about reserves, you also need to understand your balance sheet, because many trustees look at the balance sheet and think there's a really healthy number at the bottom. We're all right, we don't need to worry about reserves, we've got lots of money. But if you think back to what I said earlier, you need to remember that not all of those funds on your balance sheet may be funds that you can actually spend. So you do need to understand as part of your risk assessment which of your funds can be spent and which of your funds have got to be kept. So what happens if you are faced with a crisis and you want to start thinking about spending your permanent endowment? Well, the first thing to understand is that you can't simply decide that you will borrow from your permanent endowment funds with a view to repaying them in the future. You have a duty to retain that permanent endowment on a permanent basis, hence the terminology. So if you want to borrow the funds, you would normally need Charity Commission consent to do that. And this would normally be given on the basis of what's known as a recoupment order, which would provide that you would reimburse that expenditure out of future income. So it's effectively treated like a loan. And most recoupment orders are on the basis that the capital is repaid pound for pound without interest. There is a slight peculiarity, though, that you could in fact borrow from a third party and use your permanent endowment as security without Charity Commission consent. But if you've incorporated in the past and you now have a corporate charity that is the trustee of a separate permanent endowment trust, you do need to think about how that structure affects your ability to borrow and to use the permanent endowment assets as security for the borrowing of the corporate charity. Now, in addition, under the Charities Act, there are various provisions that enable you in certain circumstances to de-restrict your permanent endowment so it can be spent. Now, if your trustees conclude that the trusts on which the endowment is held could be carried out more effectively if the capital could be spent as well as the income, then it is possible to pass a resolution to de-restrict the capital. But there are two things to bear in mind. The first is that if your income is over £1,000 or the value of the endowment is over £10,000, then you need the Charity Commission to agree with the resolution before it will take effect. And the Commission will look at it quite stringently to decide whether or not what you want to do is sensible. And the second thing is that that statutory power cannot be used to de-restrict the trust's a functional permanent endowment. And in most cases, your almshouses will be held on trust for specific purposes, and therefore it isn't the case that you can de-restrict that permanent endowment in this way. So you need to be very clear what is available to spend and what funds can't be spent when thinking about reserves. So turning now to look at investment policies, if we can move on to the next slide. The most important thing to think about when you're looking at your investment policy is to remember two things. First of all, the suitability of your investments, by which we mean, is the type of investment appropriate, and is the actual individual asset you're going to invest in appropriate? And secondly, the need for diversification to reduce the risk to the charity of significant fluctuations in value. Now, over time, you need to be continually reviewing your investments to consider whether they remain suitable and sufficiently diversified. Now, taking into account the current situation, you need to look and see actually as to whether your investments are still appropriate in light of the pandemic or whether you need a change strategy. For example, in the past, you may have felt it appropriate to simply invest in a range of commercial properties, split between retail and office. Now, obviously, what's happened in the pandemic is that both sides of the commercial property sector have been affected, and therefore actually such a portfolio might not be sufficiently diversified. So you need to learn the lessons of what's going on and think about whether there should be an additional strategy. You also, in your investment policy, need to think about ethical investments. And certainly towards the end of last year and this year, there's been a lot more focus on climate change and whether charities should or should not be investing, taking into account climate change. And of course, we're also now starting to see questions as to whether charities should have any link with any companies that have links to historic events like the slave trade. Now, whilst in your personal life, the position is fairly straightforward, when you're a trustee, you have to think about investing for the best interests of the charity. And that's normally by investing in things that maximize the return for the charity. So engaging in ethical investment strategy is quite difficult. Now, case law does provide that if there's a clear conflict between the operations of a particular investment and the operations of your charity, you can rule out that investment. So for example, if you were a charity involved in cancer research, investing in a tobacco company would clearly be inappropriate. Secondly, you can think about whether the investment is likely to cause problems for the charity with supporters. So, for example, if your almshouse is established to help those in financial need, investing in a payday loan company might be totally inappropriate. And then finally, it's all right to consider ethical investments if they're likely to produce no worse a return than unethical investments. And we're certainly seeing a lot of investment managers putting forward a broad range of funds that meet ethical demands whilst also producing appropriate returns. So all of these things should be thought about in your investment policy, and it really needs to cover the scope of the investment powers, your investment objectives in the short term and the long term, your attitude to risk, and in particular, the extent of risk that you are prepared to take on when investing. And again, it is likely to differ when looking at that as a trustee, as opposed to looking at your individual attitude to risk. You need to think about how available you want your funds to be. Can you afford for them to be tied up for many years? And what type of investments do you want to make? You also should have a range of key performance indicators so you can ensure that your investments are meeting the sorts of standards that you want them to meet. And also, it's something that you should be reviewing on a regular basis. And you certainly should be digging out your investment policy now and saying, is it still appropriate in the current climate? So now I'm going to hand back to Liz to look at starting up again.
Thank you. So on our next slide, we should have, which will come through in a minute, I hope. Oh, there we are. And it is bracketed development projects, and that's because we've had some questions around people who have been in the middle of a development or just about to start a refurbishment or a development, which is all good positive news for almshouses, but there are some things to consider, and this pandemic's had quite an impact. So here's just a quick run through of some things to be aware of. If there was a start on site before lockdown, then it's important to remember that others will have responsibilities under their own codes of practice, for example, contractors, and you need to be aware of that. You also need to be aware of your contractual responsibilities, and this is a hugely complex area of law, which you should take professional advice on if you have actually signed a contract. It's not a matter of just putting something aside for a few weeks. You might find yourselves with a loss and expense account that you weren't thinking you were going to be presented with. So it is important to just look if you're in the process of development and the contractor is not working at the moment or is just about to come back. So keep in touch on that one and take advice if you need to, and also keep in contact and be open with your lenders. A lot of the banks who are lending to charities are going above and beyond with flexibility to try and assist and help, but they can't if they don't know there's a problem. And they'll probably be in touch with you anyway, asking how you're getting on, and it's important to keep in contact with them. If you were planning to start on site, so if you hadn't quite yet, but you were planning to do, you may have actually contractual responsibilities with other professionals who were doing some tender documentation for you, or you could have actually signed a contract but not started on site yet. So again, complex area of law, please take advice on that. But if you hadn't quite started, then you would very much have to rerun that budget, taking into account all the other risks that we've thought about, because it's not just financial, it's whether the trustees have an appetite anymore for that sort of project. You might find that trustees have actually reassessed where they are with the charity, and they may feel that they can't give that commitment anymore. So it's really important to have those board meetings and to rerun the budget. And again, take professional advice if you need to change direction and if you've signed anything. I think there is another slide just over which we'll talk about just if you were planning a refurbishment and you needed to reduce the cost. Something we do get asked quite a bit is that the cost of refurbishing, especially listed almshouses, is quite often more than you can afford, and therefore refurbishments and adjustments don't necessarily happen and take place. It is a good time to talk to your local authority about costly restrictions, especially for listed buildings. Although you won't find the planning laws changed, you might find the policies are slightly more flexible, and it is worth that conversation. So a conversation you had before COVID might not still be the same conversation you have afterwards. So it's very much worth picking those things up again. And just a note at the bottom there, if you find when you've done the process that we've been talking about, looking at your permanent endowment and your reserves and looking at your investment policy, if you're a fortunate almshouse that's well endowed and you've got funds that you think you could use, then it may be that the demand, well, it probably will be that the demand for almshouses will increase as we come out of this pandemic. And we are finding that local authorities are looking to allocate their Section 106 monies, that's the money they have from developers, speculative developers, open market developers, to put for social housing. They're opening up those funds now for almshouses. One of our biggest unique points in almshouses is that there's no right to buy. So it is housing for local people, run by local people in perpetuity, if I can use that word. Tim might not quite like the in perpetuity, I'm not sure there, but anyway, there's no right to buy, and we can use that to our advantage. So if you are looking to build new, then this may be a good time. Look at partnerships, joint ventures, collaborations. There's lots of ways of doing it. So that's starting up again, and I think the next slide, we're just going to quickly look at governance and compliance risks. So going back to where we started, which were those headings under CC26, operational, financial and governance and compliance risks, and going back to risk registers and what you should look at. These are examples of things that you would have been looking at before COVID. So these should be on your risk register anyway, and it's just an example of a difference between governance and compliance. So inappropriate organizational structure would be something you might look at under governance there, and trustee body lacking relevant skills or commitment, conflicts of interest. These are all things that you should be looking regularly at under governance. And compliance would be acting in breach of trust, poor knowledge of legal responsibilities, poor knowledge of regulatory requirements. And the regulatory requirements is interesting because sometimes almshouses are not aware, trustees are not aware, especially if they're new trustees, they're not aware that they've got a grant perhaps from the regulator of social housing or Homes England, and that possibly and probably will mean that you're now regulated by the regulator of social housing. So it's important to double check that. But also regulatory requirements around fundraising. There's a fundraising code of practice now, and there's legal responsibilities in that. Running care facilities is the obvious one with CQC, etc. So it's important to know your regulatory requirements, especially if you're thinking about expanding your objects and all that entails. And I think if we just go over to the next slide, we look at some specific governance and compliance risks that you might want to look at now that lockdown is easing. Additional trustee conflicts of interest. There's no doubt that if you're a local trustee, you may very well have got involved in volunteering with other charities within your local area. Just make sure that there's no conflict. If there is, it might not be a problem at all. It's a matter of being aware of it, recording it and managing it. So conflicts of interest are not to be forgotten. And quite often there's something that's nodded through on a board meeting, any conflicts of interest, and everybody sort of nods and says no, nothing. But actually this is about declaring new ones, and always should be about declaring new ones as well as whether there's anything that's existing. Older and vulnerable trustees not being able to undertake responsibilities. It may be that they're shielding, it may be that by virtue of age they're not able to go out and perhaps visit residents, even under social distancing. Maybe they were part of a visiting committee or a pastoral committee of old, and now they are no longer able to do that. It's important to look at those and the impact of it on the charity and on the duty of care that you have. Some trustees may be fearful of online communication. Those video meetings we talked about in our first webinar, it's very important to keep trustees engaged, your fellow trustees engaged, and if you're finding that that's not happening, then it is up to the trustee body to make sure that you include as much as possible where people can maybe join, as we say, by phone, even if they can't vote that way. Again, it goes back to your governing instrument and what powers you have to hold your meetings, but look at that and look at ways around it if you can. Trustees may be fearful of technological change, things like online banking. These things seem quite, you know, days of old. People say, oh, I really don't want to do online banking. I'll just pop to the bank. These things are no longer easy. These are risks, and these are things that you do need to be addressing. Unclear delegated authority and responsibilities, that's hugely important now. The reporting back of decisions, sort of going on to the next bullet point there about decisions being made on the hoof and fast, quick decisions being made, potentially outside current policy. If the delegated authority for those isn't clear, if the reporting isn't happening, that's when you can have operational and governance failure. So it really is important to readdress some of those delegated authorities and look at how decisions are being made and making sure that everybody who needs to know they're being reported knows it, and that it's reported back to the board at the quarterly meetings. I think I've probably just covered that lack of reporting. Decisions are being made outside the usual forums. Lack of reporting of COVID-19 with annual reports. Those of you who have audited reports, the auditor will mention this, but it is important, and the Charity Commission is expecting you to look at the impact of COVID within your annual report. It's not something that can be glossed over just in the figures section. It must come out in the narrative as well. And not keeping up with governance guidance is quite a crucial element to be looking at. And the reason I'm hesitating is because actually that also comes under that unclear whose responsibility it is. So make sure you do of trustees, somebody who's going to keep an eye on that. I am just, I think we're going to go on in a minute to, Tim's going to go on to looking at liabilities and claims, but just before we leave this, I think this slide shows that there are some potentially difficult conversations for trustees to have. If you've been listening to that and thinking, is the Charities Code of Governance. In 2017, the Charity Commission endorsed the Charities Code of Governance and used it as to look alongside the essential trustee guidance that the Charity Commission give. And the Charities Code of Governance is a checklist of what you need to be looking at as a board. It might be worth putting that on your agenda and taking it to your next meeting if you think that within here are some difficult decisions, because it's an easy prompt and you might find that other people have been thinking the same things and decisions and conversations are made a little easier. I'll hand over to Tim.
Thank you. So if we could have the next slide, please. Well, when thinking about risks, the underlying issue always is people will be thinking about what happens if something goes wrong. To what extent is it a risk for trustees personally? And personal liability is always a really big question. Now, there's an important distinction between the position of the trustees of an unincorporated charity and the trustees of a charity that is either a company limited by guarantee or a CIO. So in an unincorporated charity, the trustees are always the first port of call if there is any claim, and the claim is against them personally. Now, the trustees are entitled to be indemnified out of the assets of the charity if they've acted reasonably, or there may be trustee indemnity insurance in place if the Constitution permits the trustees to take out that type of insurance because it's a trustee benefit. But if for any reason the claim is not insured or the value of it exceeds the assets of the charity, then the trustees are jointly and severally liable for the balance. And the fact that you're acting voluntarily as a trustee doesn't alter the position. So it's very important to make sure that you minimize the risk as much as possible. Now, in a corporate charity, many of the claims would actually be against the charity itself as a corporate entity rather than the individual trustees. And in those cases, if the charity has insufficient funds to meet the claim or wasn't insured, then it's the claimant who suffers the shortfall and there is no recourse against the trustees personally. So being a trustee of a corporate charity does give you some additional protection against personal liability, but it's not an absolute protection. And on the screen, we've given some examples of different types of claims and the extent to which a trustee would or would not have personal liability. And it's important to understand that if you're a trustee of either a corporate or an unincorporated charity, you will remain with personal liability for claims that arise as a result of a breach of trust or a breach of duty, and incorporating won't particularly protect you from those claims. Now, if those claims are in a civil context, so if somebody's perhaps been injured, then the Charity Commission and the courts do have the power to relieve trustees of liability. But one of the key things they will look at is whether trustees have acted reasonably and properly, and in particular, whether you followed your risk management policy. If there's a criminal claim, and in particular one arising from a regulatory breach, then one of the advantages again of being a corporate body is that prosecution may be against the corporate entity rather than the individual trustees. But again, in both contexts, what the courts will look at is the controlling mind and the extent to which the trustees have acted reasonably and properly. So if we can move to the next slide, please. So in terms of liability, there are obviously some advantages to being a corporate charity because it can reduce personal liability in some areas. And the whole topic of incorporations is quite a detailed subject that we could look at in another webinar if there was interest. But the reality is, however you're constituted, the best way to reduce your personal risk is to make sure you've done proper risk assessments, have documented the activity, kept your policy updated on a regular basis, and that you actually have a proper policy in the first place, i.e., you've done everything that's reasonable in the circumstances. A particular risk, though, for many charities at the moment is around insolvency. And this again is one of the areas where, as a trustee, you could face personal liability, irrespective of whether or not your charity is incorporated or unincorporated. The point is that you can start to become personally liable for the debts of the charity if you go past the point of solvency and become insolvent, unless you reasonably believe that you're going to be able to effectively trade your way out back into solvency. So you really have to understand at what point do you need to start being worried. And the difficulty is that there are two different tests that are applied to decide whether or not a company is insolvent. And essentially, these are a balance sheet test, so do your assets exceed your liabilities, and a cash flow test, are you able to pay your debts as and when they fall due? Now, in most cases, you're likely to meet a balance sheet test because of the value of your almshouses, your restricted funds, your reserves, your permanent endowment, and so on. But because of the inability, as we discussed earlier, to spend some of those funds, you might actually discover that you're not solvent on a cash flow basis. And therefore, you need to be very careful to be proactive to make sure that you understand, as we said before, what funds you can spend, and be monitoring those rather than just relying upon the value of the endowments on your balance sheet. Now, if you do identify that you're starting to have problems, that doesn't mean that you need to close the charity. It means you need to think about, can we release funds from our endowment using the statutory powers that we talked about before, or are there other options? And one option that it's worth considering is merger. Now, a merger is a great way of ensuring that the spirit of your charity stays alive whilst enabling it to have a sustainable future as part of a stronger organisation. But there are a number of things that you need to think about if you are looking at a merger. The most important is whether or not you have compatible objects. So, for example, if your almshouse was established to assist women aged over 65 who live in a particular area of benefit, merging with another charity whose almshouse are for men aged over 50, albeit in the same area of benefit, is not completely straightforward. So you need to choose your merger partner very carefully, carry out full and appropriate due diligence, and think about whether or not you are going to have to look at changing objects. There's also various different ways to do mergers. One can involve one charity taking over the other, or both charities can be dissolved and the assets transferred into a completely new entity. In addition, if you're thinking about merger, it's very important not to spook your residents, and therefore you need to make sure that once you start to look at it seriously, that you are communicating with people so they understand what is going on. And again, mergers is something we could look at in a lot more detail if there was interest for a future seminar. So if we can move to the next slide, please. So all of this about risk management is about living with uncertainty. And it's very clear that the risks of operating an almshouse charity have not diminished. And due to the world we face ourselves with, the question of what is normal is changing on a daily basis. So your risk policy and your management of risk has become much more important than it ever was before. And it's not enough to simply have a policy and keep it in your drawer. You need to implement it and monitor it on a regular basis. But as we've explained, your duty of care is measured by what is reasonable in the circumstances. And it's therefore important that you should be able to show that you're doing your best and that you are thinking about what is reasonable. Now, one way to protect yourself is, of course, to take professional advice. If you've relied upon professional advice and things go wrong, then you're normally in a better position than if you failed to take any advice at all. But it's very easy for me to say that, and I appreciate that the cost of taking advice can be prohibitive. And many charities will see that cost of taking professional advice as really very much a last resort. And the other complication is that you need to take on board the fact that professional advisors have very little idea what is coming down the track. 6 months ago, your advisors wouldn't have been suggesting that you cater for a pandemic on your risk register. As you probably noticed at the introduction to this webinar, I had to say the date that we're giving this webinar on so that when it's accessed on the website by people in 2, 3, 4 weeks' time, it's clear that it covers the position in the moment. So actually the advice is being given as at today's date. So you really do need to remember that just getting professional advice isn't going to necessarily be the end of the question. You need to keep updating it and thinking about if it changes. But most of the risk management process is based upon the philosophy of being prepared for the unknown unknowns and having a methodology in place to decide how to deal with them. And the most simple strategy for dealing with risk is to remember that you are not looking to eradicate all risks completely. What you need to do is to approach all of your risks with a very simple strategy based upon the 4 T's, because there are essentially 4 ways to deal with risk. You can treat it. So for example, if you have a leaky gas pipe in one of your properties, you mend it. You can transfer your risk. So many of you will have insurance just in case your almshouse burns down, and that's a case where you've transferred your risk to a third party. In some cases, you'll have to tolerate the risk. So you may have stairs in your almshouses that are very steep, but there's nothing you can do about it because you can't knock them down and build a new staircase. So you fit handrails and put those in place to make sure that the risk is minimized. Or finally, you terminate the risk. Maybe you have an almshouse that's pretty much in a condemned condition and you decide, unfortunately, we need to close it. So by identifying and managing your risks in this way, you'll be able to deal with the uncertainty going forward. So if we can move on to the next slide, that brings us to an end of the formal part, and now we can move on to the questions that have been coming in during the seminar. I'm very keen not to refer to Trevor from Northampton like the Prime Minister, but it's very tempting to do that. But looking at the questions, first question, we've been asked if we could explain the rules around rent holidays for commercial leasehold tenants, which was something we picked up on in the last webinar, but more than happy to cover that again. So last time we spoke, we were making the point that if you were to decide to say to your commercial tenants, okay, we know there's a pandemic on, life is difficult, don't pay the rent and give them a rent holiday, that could be viewed as an ex gratia payment and something that the trustees can't do without Charity Commission consent. And what we said last time round was that it would be sensible to defer any decision on rent holidays until a later date when it was a bit clearer what was happening. Now, obviously, things have moved on. The lockdowns continued for a very long period of time, and we've seen that actually easing the lockdown is taking longer than people expected, and many shops and commercial tenants are finding themselves in greater difficulty than they thought. So we're starting to get into the territory where actually you'll be saying to commercial tenants, please pay the rent, and they'll be saying, well, we can't pay the rent because we're struggling. And you then have to think to yourself, okay, if we were to bring a claim against them for the rent that we are legally entitled to, what is likely to be the outcome of that claim? Is it going to force them into insolvency? Is it going to mean that we actually don't get anything at all because we don't have a tenant for 3 or 4 years because we put them out of business, and so on? And provided that you can justify that you are essentially compromising a claim, so you've got a claim for rent and you're compromising it by taking a lower amount, provided that's justified, then it's acceptable to think about doing that, but make sure that you document what you're doing. Equally though, if you have a very large commercial tenant who's maybe part of a large chain of a part of a big company, and clearly they can afford to go on paying the rent, then they should go on paying the rent. Liz, I don't know if you want to take the question about self-isolation.
Yes, that's an interesting one, isn't it? So somebody has asked, they have somebody moving from a different part of the country into a new almshouse, into an almshouse of theirs soon. Do they need to self-isolate? And I think the point there is that we can't go ahead of the government guidance. So you just need to be aware of what the government guidance says. And in terms of, so you could implement social distancing, or you could ask them to self-isolate. You could ask them, when you self-isolate, you're not necessarily imposing it, you're just giving it as guidance and saying, please, can you do that? So it's all about how the trustees feel that risk. Do the trustees feel that there is a risk there? If there is, how are you going to manage it? And then look at how you're going to manage it within the government guidelines. So potentially asking somebody to self-isolate for 14 days is not something the government would be necessarily asking you to do, but you may feel that that is what you should be doing as trustees in order to tick your box of duty of care. So it's all about the reasonableness, and it is a decision down to you. So I think that's the answer to that one. I don't know whether you want to add anything to that, Tim.
Well, I was just going to add, it's interesting because, of course, according to the figures, the risk from the virus in London is actually lower than it is anywhere else in the country. So it may actually be sensible to say to the person who's moving, you may wish to self-isolate because you may be moving to an area where the virus is stronger than you've been used to. Just picking up on 2 very quick points. There's a question about, is the previous seminar still available to view? The answer to that is yes, it's available on our website and on the Trust Partnerships website. And there's some interest in an incorporation seminar. So I think certainly we would be happy to look at doing an incorporation seminar in a few weeks' time. And then I think there was a question for you. Somebody couldn't hear the percentage deduction figure which you expected as a reduction in income as quoted by investment fund managers.
So that is between 20 and 30%, but it's up to 30% is what we are being advised to budget for.
And we have one final question, which is about operational risks. An almshouse that has a younger resident who has started an online photography business from his apartment. There's nothing stopping this in his letter of appointment or residence handbook. Should we be concerned about this? I suppose from my point of view, the question would be whether he's carrying on a business which he shouldn't be carrying on from a private residence, which is an issue probably more for him than for the almshouse. But I think you probably should be having a discussion with him to check whether what he's doing actually is appropriate. Liz, I don't know if you've got a view on that.
No, I think that then, and whoever asked did say that it wasn't, that there's nothing in the letter of appointment. So that is something to look at for the future, is in your letter of appointment. You might want, and you are recommended to put that residents should not be carrying out a business from their flat, from their accommodation. But I don't think I can add anything to that than you've just said, Tim, to be honest. Sorry, I'm sorry. I think, yeah, I can't add.
Okay. And another question we've asked is it possible to receive a copy of just the slides for this webinar and the last one, rather than just seeing it as part of the video recording? Yes, we can certainly add a copy of the slides to the email that comes out sending the link to the webinar at the end. Well, thank you everyone for attending. We've slightly run over.
Just sorry, Tim, there was one other question there which said, what action can Almshouse charities take if residents don't abide by extending lockdown rules put in place by the charity? And they are guidance. There's nothing that you can do apart from communicate and show that you have done all you can, use all your reasonable endeavours to communicate and try and educate the person who's causing the problem. But it is a really difficult one, and it is all about communication, I'm afraid.
Yes, and again, if you've got a provision in your scheme for making rules, and that's referred to in your letter of appointment, it's something you may want to be reminding the residents of. Well, thank you. So we've run slightly over, but a bit better time this time rather than last time. So thank you very much for joining us. And we certainly will be thinking about a date for a future seminar on incorporations and also possibly mergers as well. But if you do have any other feedback as to other subjects that you'd like us to continue in the series, then we'll be more than happy to do that. So thank you very much.
Thank you.